Hi everyone, welcome to the Bridgewater Chess Club. Today we're going to look at a game between Dave and Zoe, give a quick analysis, and provide some feedback. Enjoy! In this game, Zoe's playing the white pieces, Dave has black, and this bar on the left-hand side shows the computer engine's thoughts on where things stand in the game. Zoe starts with the most common chess opening move, e4. Dave responds with e5. Zoe develops the knight to f3. Dave moves his knight to c6. Zoe moves bishop to c4. Dave moves his bishop to c5. And then Zoe moves the knight to g5. And in this position, you can see the computer did not like that move, as unfortunately, I think Zoe forgot to move pawn to d3, which would have opened up her bishop and protected her knight. You can see that Zoe's playing a very aggressive style, as both the knight and the bishop are attacking the pawn on f7 right out of the gate. Dave saw that the knight was hanging and took with his queen. Zoe develops to c3. Dave moves his knight to f6. And Zoe launches another attack. And in this case, it's a double. Zoe's dark squared bishop is lined up with Dave's queen, and the pawn newly moved to d4 is attacking Dave's bishop on c5. Now Dave did see that his queen was attacked and moved the queen to h5. It might have been tempting for Zoe to take the bishop right away, but she correctly takes first with the queen. The reason that this is the correct move is that if she had taken the bishop, Dave would have been able to respond by taking her queen, and she would have had to take back with the king, preventing her from being able to castle. So Zoe takes back, moving her queen to h5. Dave takes the queen back, and Zoe's able to take the bishop on c5, evening the board. Dave moves to d6, and Zoe prefers knight safety and castles. Dave takes the pawn on c5, and Zoe lashes out with b4. Dave takes, and we have a little bit of exchange that happens here, with Dave being up on pawns. Zoe develops knight to c3. Dave moves his pawn to f5. Zoe takes, and Dave is able to take with tempo, developing his light squared bishop while taking back the pawn. Zoe, again with the aggressive attack, moves knight to d5, hoping that maybe Dave doesn't notice that she is attacking the pawn on c7, which would give a check and allow Zoe to take the rook on a8. Dave did notice, and they traded knights on the d-file. And again, Dave able to develop with tempo. Zoe has to react to the rook pointing directly at her light squared bishop, which she does, retreating it to f3 and attacking Dave's knight on h5. Dave saw the threat and immediately moved the knight, and Zoe's able to develop, moving her dark squared bishop to a3 and connecting her rooks. Unfortunately, Zoe's bishop is in a pretty tough position here. Probably the best move, as these squares are both defended, is taking the bishop to e2. But Zoe's been aggressive so far, and she's not going to change her play style now. She lashes back out with g4, which the computer doesn't like, but Dave decided to let the trade go. And you can see that Zoe's king is in a tough spot, not as protected as it should be, and the g2 square is being defended by the pawn here. Dave moves knight to d5, and Zoe moves bishop to b2, attacking Dave's pawn on g7. Now Dave decided to defend this pawn, but an interesting play would have been to let Zoe go ahead and take that. And let's just look at this real quickly if Dave makes any move, and then Zoe decides to take on g7. In this position, Dave's rook would be pinning this pawn as Zoe can't move it, putting herself in check. Now you might be thinking, well, Zoe could just defend her bishop with the f6 pawn, but unfortunately that pin still exists. So Dave can easily take that pawn with the knight, and the bishop cannot move to take the knight back, and Zoe is just going to be down a bishop in this spot. But that's not what was played. Dave chose to defend the pawn on g7. Zoe moves to h4, giving her king a flight square, a very necessary flight square, and Dave, not unsurprisingly, moves down to g6, trying to open up the g file for his rooks. Zoe takes, Dave takes back with the rook, and Zoe is able to utilize the flight square that she gave herself. Dave doubles up his rooks on the g file, getting ready to come down and start harassing Zoe's king with checks. Zoe moves the bishop to c1. I believe Zoe's plan is to park her bishop here on g5, preventing these two from coming down and wreaking havoc with her king. Unfortunately, Dave's just in a position where he can take advantage of this, and Zoe's forced to move to h3. Dave moves to h5. Zoe moves her bishop up to d2. And now Dave has the king pretty secured, moving his rook to g4, and that king has no more legal moves. In this position, if this bishop is out of the way, Dave is able to throw a checkmate here, moving his knight to f4. So thankfully this bishop is here to stop that. Zoe decides that she's going to sacrifice a rook to get her king out of harm's way. Dave accepts that, and Zoe moves out to a4, trying to promote her pawn. Dave moving his pawn to c6. Zoe continues to march up. Dave attacks the f pawn. Zoe protects it, moving the king to g3. And Dave launches the b pawn to b5. Zoe takes back en passant, and Dave correctly takes back with the pawn, making these pawns connected and able to walk down and promote to queen. Zoe takes the pawn on f3. Dave starts the march. And unfortunately in this position, it's pretty well a foregone conclusion that Zoe just has no pawns. Dave's going to be able to march and promote these and achieve checkmate, so Zoe resigns here. A very good game with Zoe playing incredibly aggressively, and Dave sticking more to the book and trying to make sure that he was taking advantage of moving his pieces with tempo, gaining some advantage with being a couple of pawns up, and then just leaning onto that advantageous position and getting Zoe to resign here. A great game by both. I hope you enjoyed the analysis, and I look forward to seeing some of you every Wednesday from 6 to 7:30 at the Bridgewater Public Library. Thank you very much.